Chapter 7 Yearnings. Nobuo was now in the third year of high school, and Machiko in the third year of junior school. "Hurry up, or we'll be late for school," she called to him from the entrance hall. Nobuo was lingering in the house, putting his books into his satchel and taking them out again. "Did you hear me?" Machiko sounded as if she was on the verge of tears. "I don't mind if you go without me," shouted Nobuo, and Machiko set off alone. Nobuo followed slowly after her at a distance. Now that he was 14, for some reason or other, Nobuo disliked going to school with Machiko. She always spoke in such a loud voice, things like, "Look, Nobuo, what is that red flower called?" Or, "Don't you think that girl is pretty?" He had never thought anything of this habit of hers before, but now he found it unbearably embarrassing. For example, a few days before, at the school entrance, a pretty girl had come up to them. "Nobuo, this is Keiko Miyakawa. Don't you think she's pretty?" Machiko had said in a loud voice, and Nobuo had blushed scarlet, as if his whole body had been set on fire. Altogether, he felt that Machiko's voice was far too loud. She was quite without reserve and made friends with people in no time, not just with the girls of her own class, but with senior girls as well. So whenever he went to school with Machiko, he would find himself surrounded by a horde of girls. No wonder he hated going with her these days. Gazing at her back as she tripped along, he thought what strange creatures girls were. Even when mention was made of a woman in books he was reading, he felt a sort of choking feeling. If the woman was beautiful, this feeling was mysteriously heightened so that he could hardly breathe. As he tried to visualize the beautiful woman, if she were a married woman, the face he would see in his mind would be his mother's. If she were an unmarried girl, strangely enough he would imagine the girl who had gone away 3 years ago, Yoshikawa's sister, Fujiko. He told no one about this. He could not understand how it was that Fujiko, who, when he had seen her last, had not even started school, should appear to him as the beautiful young woman in the book. In Nobuo's class there were several beautiful girls. The daughter of a wealthy shoemaker, whenever she passed Nobuo in the corridor, would blush deeply, lower her eyes and hide her face in the sleeve of her kimono. Nobuo's heart would throb violently, but she was nothing like as beautiful as Fujiko, whose face he saw whenever he read a novel. "I wonder where old Yoshikawa is now," he asked himself. Since the summer in the 4th grade, when he had whispered that he was going to Hokkaido, there had been no news of Yoshikawa. Nobuo had no idea whether he had gone to Hokkaido as he supposed, or where he was. Hokkaido seemed too far away for there to be much chance of ever meeting again. Yoshikawa used to say he was going to be a priest, he recalled. He still remembered how he himself had made a pact with Yoshikawa to do the same. He would look at his own little finger and think how it had been linked with Yoshikawa's thick one, symbolic of their promise. It all seemed such a long, long time ago, yet interestingly enough, Yoshikawa and Fujiko themselves were still fresh in his memory. "Nobuo, how about a spot of flower viewing?" Takashi suggested one Saturday afternoon. Nobuo enjoyed an outing with Takashi, but he found little pleasure in flower viewing or festivals these days. "I've got to study," was his excuse for refusing the invitation. Takashi's face reminded Nobuo of the famous Takamori Saigo. His eyes were always laughing, and he gave the impression of being able to behave like a spoiled child without any qualms. "Have you really got work to do?" Takashi opened his eyes wide in disbelief, and Nobuo felt that he could see into his very soul. He shook his head and laughed in confusion. "You scoundrel, you've changed lately." Takashi lowered himself heavily into a cross-legged position in front of Nobuo. Nobuo instinctively sat up straight. "There's no need to go all formal," Takashi smiled. "Do you really think I've changed?" "Well, I suppose it's your age. You've become an adolescent." Nobuo flushed at the use of the word. "Why do you think it is that you don't go around with Machiko these days?" "It's because you've reached adolescence. For the next 2 or 3 years you'll feel shy about visiting other people's houses." I can remember the feeling of not being interested in going to see the cherry blossom anymore. Takashi bowed his head. "Do you mean to say there was a time when you hated to go out too?" asked Nobuo with a touch of relief in his voice. Takashi liked nothing more than going out, if he had the time. There was no one like Takashi for being able to supply details of where a new house was being built, whether the cherry blossom buds were swelling, whether the food at such and such a place was tasty or not, and so on. There was indeed. I never went anywhere, but stayed in my room and got more and more introspective, wondering if I'd live very long. As a result, I'd down about 7 or 8 bowls of rice at one meal. Takashi guffawed. Nobuo was surprised, not by Takashi's coarse laughter, but by the fact that these days he himself felt that for some reason or other he would not live to old age. He would puzzle for hours over why human beings had to die. Sometimes he would have a vivid memory of the face of his grandmother Tos in death, and would wonder what kind of death he would have. Takashi, why do human beings die? Nobuo's face was serious. They die because they're alive, I guess. Takashi's expression was calm. They die because they are alive? That seemed a logical explanation, but Nobuo felt that he had been given an evasive answer. If a person is living, wouldn't you expect them to go on living forever? He said. There's something in that. I've wondered, too, why people don't live forever. Nobuo, do you know this saying, living we die, meeting we part? Yes, my teacher taught it to us. It means that living things must inevitably die and people who meet must part. That made Nobuo think of Osamu Yoshikawa. In a couple of years from now, the friends in his class would all be scattered, and he would have said goodbye to his teacher. And this Takamori Saigo's double, Takashi, would have to go away when he finished university. And inescapably the day would come when he, Nobuo, would be separated from his father, his mother, and Machiko. Whenever he contemplated these things, Nobuo felt that life was an empty, melancholy thing. If meeting means parting, surely it would be better not to meet anyone in the first place, he told himself, and felt a bitter desolation at the bottom of his heart. That's right. It's just as your teacher said. Living we die means simply that people who are alive die. As to why they die, no matter how hard people think about it, nobody knows the answer. All I know is that someday I'll die, and someday you'll die too. Is that so? Nobuo wondered. Can it be true that no one knows why people die? Aren't you afraid of dying? He asked his cousin. It's a frightening thought. Even if I knew I was going to die, I'd want to live just a moment longer, but I suppose there's no getting away from it. So it's impossible to live forever under any circumstances? That's asking too much. It's true that your mother believes in eternal life and all that, but eternal life? That's what Yaso followers believe. Looking at Nobuo, he continued, Nobuo, I bet you'll turn Yaso one of these days, and laughed. Nobuo was indignant. Me? I'll never turn Yaso. I'd sooner die, he declared. There's no need to make such categorical statements. Swearing that you will never do such and such is not so straightforward as people think. Yes, but Nobuo felt uneasy. You see, human beings don't necessarily live their lives as they plan them. Take me, for instance. I had an ambition to come to Tokyo, keep my nose to the grindstone, and come out top of my class at Imperial University. But look what's happened. I lose my head over every girl I meet. Rather than wanting to study, I just can't wait to play around with girls. When Takashi got onto this subject, Nobuo started to blush. How about you? Don't you ever dream about girls? He asked, blowing a cloud of tobacco smoke over Nobuo. Nobuo got redder and redder. His body was already a man's body. He had many a time dreamed of a woman, though where she came from he did not know. You dream of a woman and feel you want to hold her hand. That's because you're a man. I think a lot about women. There's nothing wrong in that. There are some fellows who will tell you that it's unmanly to think about women. That's all a big lie. A woman is a man's indispensable living companion. Thinking about women is neither unmanly nor dirty. Takashi concluded. His face was serious. Nobuo thought of Fujiko's face. He pictured her, not as the little girl she had been, but as a teenager like himself. Needless to say, the day slipped away without either of them going to see the cherry blossoms. Since Takashi had come to live with them, Masayuki had begun going to church with Kiku, but recently his church attendance, even on Sundays, had become rather spasmodic. It must be my age. I don't know why, but I feel tired, he would say, and spend the day pottering about the house. You've just turned 40. That's no age at all. You'd better see a doctor at once, or else. Takashi was plainly anxious, but both Masayuki and Kiku were unconcerned. You've been working hard. I expect you are tired. Just take things easy on Sunday, Kiku would advise. She seemed unaware that there could be something wrong with Masayuki. All the same, Nobuo felt uneasy when he saw his father looking so haggard. "Mother, don't you think it would be better if father saw a doctor?" he asked. He did not say it in as many words, but he implied that his mother was to blame for going off to church and leaving his father at home. Come rain, come snow, she went to church every Sunday morning. Whenever the two of them and Machiko set off together, Nobuo could never get used to his feeling of emptiness at being left behind. Since the arrival of Takashi, there had been English lessons, outings together to Asakusa and so on, so that, although his parents were out on Sundays, Nobuo had plenty of activities of his own. Nevertheless, at the sight of them going off with Machiko, his old feeling of envy would return. "Nobuo's right, Aunt Kiku. Why don't you give church a miss sometimes? Nobuo always looks lonely on Sunday. Even more than have you call a doctor, Nobuo would like you to stay at home." As usual, Takashi spoke without restraint. "That's not the reason. It's just that father is—" Nobuo was thrown into confusion. "I don't need a doctor. Off you go, Kiku," urged Masayuki, his head pillowed on his arms. Nobuo was afraid his father was purposely rebuffing him. But Kiku was less concerned about Masayuki's health than she was about what Takashi had just said, and looked at Nobuo anxiously. But Nobuo pretended not to notice and opened the book he was reading. "Nobuo's not a child. He's in the 3rd year of high school," Masayuki said persuasively. "Don't forget to buy us lots of tasty things to eat on your way home," joked Takashi. "Trust you to think of that." "All right then, I'll see you later," Kiku answered, smiling at Takashi. Nobuo was unable to share in this sense of intimacy between Takashi and Kiku. His mother seemed closer to Takashi than she was to him. "I wish Nobuo would start coming to church with us too, don't you, mother?" Machiko looked at Nobuo with the expression she always adopted when she went to church. He could not stand her on these occasions. He hated this condescending attitude, but the way she seemed to look upon her mother as her exclusive possession aroused his anger even more. "Nobuo, why the vacant expression?" asked Takashi, almost crushing his shoulder with his grip as he led him into his own room. Once there, he continued, "The trouble with you is that you are too reserved towards your mother." He never minced words. "It's nothing of the kind, it's just—" "Is that so? Then do you mean to tell me that you dislike her?" Dislike her? Far from disliking her, Nobuo held her in the deepest adoration. It was just that somehow he could not feel at ease with her. He would like to be able to unburden himself, to confide in her, tell her all he was thinking, but as was to be expected, he found it hard to express himself. "Do you know, mother, the dog next door smiles when it sees me." Machiko would make nonsensical remarks like this to her mother. "Do dogs smile?" Kiku would laugh in amusement. "Of course they do. Machiko," he says, "something wonderful is going to happen to you today. I'm sure of it. That's why he smiles." "That's good, isn't it?" Nobuo envied Machiko's ability to say such things. Why couldn't he say things as easily? "Mother, I was dreaming about you last night. You were carrying armfuls of pretty flowers." Machiko would talk on about her dream. Nobuo had dreams about his mother too, but he could not talk about them. "You've got to learn to say what you are thinking, clearly. Even parents and children aren't so transparent that they understand each other without communicating. Isn't that what words are for?" Takashi insisted. Then he added with a smile, "You'll have a lot of trouble when you fall in love, because you're too shy to say what you think." At the very mention of the word love, Nobuo's heart started to thump, and he lowered his head in embarrassment. The weather had been damp and sticky for days on end. One day when Nobuo came home from school, Machiko came running out to meet him. "Something terrible has happened." "What's the matter?" Perhaps his father had been taken ill or something, but Machiko was obviously just teasing. Her face was covered in smiles. "Guess what?" she urged him. "What? I've no idea." Nobuo purposely ignored her and walked into the house. Machiko ran in after him and held out a letter under his nose. "Take a look at this." Nobuo had never received a letter in his life. He turned it over in amazement. "It's from Yoshikawa," he exclaimed. Dropping his books, he tore open the envelope. His fingers trembled. "Dear Nagano," it began, I've been such a long time in writing to you. Are you well? I expect you've grown a lot. It's 3 years since I came to Hokkaido. My mother and sister and I are well, but my father died suddenly a short time ago. He coughed up blood and died. They say it's because he drank too much and damaged his stomach. While he was alive, I thought he was a terrible father because he was cruel to my mother, but now he is dead. I feel very sad. Death is a strange thing. I wonder that we don't feel more resentment about it. Fujiko is well. She reads a lot of books these days and is quite grown up. Perhaps it's because of her bad leg, but she seems much more grown up than other children of her age. Before coming to Hokkaido, I thought it was an awful place, but once I actually came to live here, I felt as though I'd never lived anywhere else. Sapporo is a fine place. I was surprised to see so much snow in the winter. The surface of the snow is above the level of my head, and it piles up right to the roof. But the scenery is wonderful, with the pure, spotless white of the snow. Perhaps you have completely forgotten about me. My father left Tokyo heavily in debt, so he said that I mustn't write to my teachers or friends. That's why I've not written to you. I can't tell you how much I would like to meet you again. Yoshikawa's rounded handwriting gave Nobuo a nostalgic feeling. Still standing, he read the letter through once more. Then he sat down and read it again. Hokkaido suddenly seemed very near. Nobuo was no longer aware of the rainy season and the unpleasant sticky heat of Tokyo. He felt a new strength rising through his body, just through reading Yoshikawa's letter. He seated himself at his desk, intending to write an immediate reply, but his heart was thumping strangely. He sharpened his pencil industriously. "Dear Yoshikawa," he began, "how time flies. I cannot tell you how thrilled I was to receive your letter." Reading over what he had just written, Nobuo realized that it struck him as rather peculiar. Seeing that Yoshikawa's letter had told him about his father's death, he would sound a cold-hearted creature for saying he was thrilled. Nevertheless, I am thrilled, he told himself. He read through Yoshikawa's letter once again, for the 4th time. The more he read it, the more keenly he felt how terrible it must have been for Yoshikawa to lose his father. What if my father were to die, he thought. These days, the sight of his own father's ailing body filled him with anxiety. Just supposing father were to die now, the thought of what would happen to Nobuo himself was enough to upset him badly. First of all, who would go out to work so that they could keep body and soul together? It was unthinkable that his mother Kiku would work. He knew that there would be no alternative but for him to get a job. As for that, he could think of nothing except getting an apprenticeship in a big store, and how lonely mother and Machiko would be. As he chewed over these possibilities, he realized how Yoshikawa must be feeling his father's death and hated himself for saying he was thrilled. Trying to picture the kind of life Yoshikawa must be living now, Nobuo picked up his pencil and began again. Dear Yoshikawa, how the time has flown. Ever since the day you left for Hokkaido, I have wished very much that I could meet you again. Sometimes I have studied the map and wondered where you were. Today, when I received your letter, I was so excited that my fingers couldn't keep still as I tried to open the envelope. Then, when I read your letter, I was so sorry to hear that your father had died. It must have been very sad for you. Now that he has gone, I wonder who will work and provide for your family. I can hardly bear to imagine how terrible it must be for you to have to work. You are just 14, the same age as I am. But do keep on at it and don't give up. So even Hokkaido is home to those who live there, is it? I was surprised to hear that the snow piles right up to the roof. It must be terribly cold. I am just the same as usual. My cousin from Osaka is living with us while he attends university here. He is an interesting person and is teaching me English. Machiko is bursting with health. School is much the same as usual, but the teacher who was in charge of our class when you left is not there anymore. Well, I'll write again sometime. Goodbye. Nobuo Nagano. Nobuo read over what he had just written. The truth was that he really had been thrilled to receive Yoshikawa's letter, and his words of sympathy over the death of Yoshikawa's father somehow sounded insincere. It's strange, he thought, putting the letter back on the desk and gazing out of the window. It was drizzling outside. The little paper doll that Machiko had made as a charm to keep the rain away hung limply from the eaves. Yes, it's strange, he thought again. Nobuo was still fond of Yoshikawa. It was true that he had sometimes wished he could meet him again. Yet in spite of this, he found it impossible to enter genuinely into the grief that Yoshikawa must be feeling. Nobuo read his letter through once more. As he did so, something else struck him. There was nothing in it about Fujiko. Although from the beginning he had meant to mention her, he had succeeded in giving the impression that no thought was further from his mind. I've written nothing but a pack of lies. So even in a simple thing like a letter, it was difficult to express oneself without reserve. And even if he had expressed his true feelings, it seemed to him his letter would hardly sound sincere. Either way, it would be unconvincing. So Nobuo was filled with apprehension at the thought of Yoshikawa reading what he had written. To think that his friendship with Yoshikawa depended on such an uncertain link. At length, however, in spite of his misgivings, he posted the letter. When he awoke on Sunday morning, Nobuo had a shivering sensation in his back. In the rainy season, the bedding did not get a chance to air properly, and this was probably why he had caught a chill. His throat ached and his whole body felt limp. As usual, Machiko had been up and dressed in her Sunday best for some time, and was dancing around the house. What a peculiar creature, getting so excited about going to church. She seems to prefer church to school, he thought to himself with distaste, and turned over in bed. Breakfast's ready, you know. Machiko came to wake Nobuo, but he just lay there with his eyes shut, as if it were too much of an effort to speak. You sleepyhead, she teased, whisking his quilt away. His body trembled and he instinctively curled up to keep warm. You're making me cold, he croaked at her. Oh! Machiko got a fright when she saw the anger on his face, for it was genuine. Sleepyhead! She called again, fleeing into the living room. Nobuo pulled the quilt around himself again, but he still felt cold and miserable. What's the matter? Aren't you up yet? Inquired Masayuki, who had just finished washing. Nobuo looked up at his father without replying. I say, you're not looking very well. Masayuki knelt on one knee and placed his hand on Nobuo's forehead. Kiku! Kiku! He called urgently. He did not get flustered as a rule. What's happened? No sooner had Kiku entered the room than she placed her own forehead against Nobuo's. Nobuo blushed with embarrassment and joy. He had often seen Kiku press her cheek against Machiko's, but he had never had it pressed against his. The day when he met Kiku for the first time, she had hugged him closely, but since then she had done nothing more than lay her hand on his shoulder occasionally. Now the fact that his mother unhesitatingly placed her forehead on his gave Nobuo a feeling of deep peace at the bottom of his heart. The doctor was called at once. Kiku watched closely while he examined Nobuo. Looking up at Kiku's anxious face, Nobuo fell asleep again. Everything was so dark. He was walking barefoot along a pitch-black road. His feet were unbearably cold. He was on the way to school, but somehow he was lost. If only his feet were not so cold. They were cold, but strangely enough his head was hot. Those sparks are flying towards me. Wondering why his head was so hot, he turned around and saw that somebody's house was on fire. His body felt so heavy. I'm tired, so tired. He crouched down and fell asleep on the spot. After a while, Nobuo suddenly opened his eyes. The light bulb was a yellow ball above his head. Nobuo? Kiku was bending over to look at him. He smiled a faint smile of amusement at the anxious look in her eyes. You've been asleep for hours. So that's it. I've been asleep, dreaming, he thought. He looked at his mother in a daze. Does your head ache? Kiku wrung out a cold cloth. From somewhere outside came the sound of the wooden clappers of the night watchman. Nobuo realized to his surprise that it was the middle of the night. He looked at Kiku and tried to say something, but before he could form the words, he fell asleep again. He was conscious of someone feeding him with gruel, and he imagined that the doctor came and said something. He was aware, too, of having his night clothes changed. The thing that he was most conscious of was the searing pain in his throat. It was not until the middle of the following night that Nobuo became fully conscious. Nobuo. Kiku's face was close to his. Everything's all right now. Was your throat terribly sore? Nobuo nodded docilely. Mother, please go to bed now. How long have I been asleep? Ever since yesterday morning you've had a high fever and scarcely opened your eyes. Since yesterday morning. Nobuo looked at his mother in amazement. She must have been sitting by his side all the time. Nobuo looked at her, with her ornamental waistband neatly fastened, sitting so correctly. "Mother, haven't you been asleep at all?" Kiku shook her head. "I was worried about you being so ill," she replied gently. "Does mother care for me as much as all that?" He wondered in amazement. An inexpressibly sweet sensation of joy welled up within him. His mother was so beautiful and gentle, he even had a yearning love for her. But never before had Nobuo felt that he could utterly trust her. He had always felt there was something in her that he had to be on his guard against. He had been unable to accept the fact that his mother had something more precious to her than he was. Can there be a mother in the whole wide world who would do such a thing as desert her child as she did? He had asked himself miserably when he was younger. Such wretched feelings could not be healed in just a few years. Nobuo desperately wanted to know whether his mother really loved him. Now, as he realized that she had been so anxious about the outcome of his illness that she had not slept since the morning of the day before, this unutterable joy and relief swept over him. So she really is my mother after all. She's not just Machiko's mother, he thought. He was absolutely delighted. Mother! He wanted to express this joy in words, but by saying her name, he at once felt he had adequately expressed all that he wanted to tell her. He had never felt like this before in his life. "What is it, Nobuo?" Kiku's eyes were wet with tears. "What's the matter, mother? Why are you crying?" The old Nobuo had never been able to ask about things as gently as this. "I was so worried that your illness might grow worse. You see, your temperature was so high for such a long time. But now it's such a relief to see my Nobuo awake again." "Are you crying because you are relieved, mother?" "It's funny, isn't it? Whether we are happy or sad, we can't help crying." Kiku softly wiped the corners of her eyes with the edge of her kimono sleeve. "My mother is happy because I'm not going to die. She really is my mother," Nobuo reminded himself again. "Nobuo, isn't it wonderful? It's really wonderful." Machiko was leaning over and gazing at him. It was the following morning. Yes? He had sometimes been jealous of her intimacy with their mother, but it was quite different this morning. Machiko's round eyes were very appealing as she looked down at him. "I'm still a child, you see, so Daddy and Mummy said, 'Go to bed,' when it was night." She took her doll, which was by her side, and held it out to Nobuo. "But this doll sat by your side all the time and didn't sleep. She was so anxious for you. Instead of me, you see. I promised the Lord Jesus that I would let you have this doll if he made you get better quickly." Then Machiko put her hands together to pray. "Dear God," she said, "thank you very much for hearing Machiko's prayer. Thank you very much indeed. Now Nobuo is able to eat his food again. I will truly give him this doll to keep, so please don't let him get sick again. In Jesus' name, amen." This was the first time that Nobuo had heard Machiko pray. He was moved. Machiko's doll was about 18 inches high, wearing a red flowery kimono with long sleeves. Usually Machiko took such great care of it that she would hardly even let her mother touch it. Needless to say, no matter how much her friends pleaded with her, she would not so much as allow them to hold it. It was unbelievable that she should be wanting to give this precious doll to Nobuo. Nobuo wondered if he would be prepared to give his most treasured possession, a paperweight inlaid with mother of pearl, to Machiko. He could hardly bring himself to think of such a thing. So, as he realized what it meant to her, he saw how much she cared for him. To think that this little sister of his was capable of doing something which he felt incapable of doing, it suddenly struck Nobuo that Machiko was a remarkable person. "Thank you, Machiko, but I'm a boy, so I don't need a doll," he said gently. "Never mind, I'm giving it to you because I promised Jesus I would." Machiko's face was earnest. "That's all right. This doll is your own very, very special doll." "Well then, Nobuo, you pray to Jesus then. Say, 'I'm giving the doll back which she said she'd given to you, and please don't be angry with her.'" Pray. I'm not a Yaso. I don't know how to pray. But no sooner had he said this than he thought of how she had prayed, giving up her doll for his sake, and he suddenly felt ashamed of saying Yaso in such a hateful way. "If you don't know how to pray, will you let me teach you?" Nobuo did not know what to reply to this. He had said he could not accept the doll, and he was unable to pray. He was at a complete loss for words.